Okay, we are going to get into our last panel of the day here, so home stretch. All right, when it comes to building transmission lines, colocation offers one possible solution to overcoming challenges like siting, permitting, and land use. In our final panel today, you will hear from leaders who advance colocation efforts here in Colorado, and we'll discuss how that can translate to the rest of the West. I will turn it over to Maury to kick us off here.
Okay, I'm Maury Galbraith again with the Colorado Electric Transmission Authority. I think what we're going to do is we're going to have introductions, and so we'll have each of the panelists provide a brief introduction. And then, Randy, I think the plan was to have you talk about the Next Gen project in a sort of more fulsome, robust way. And then we'll have some moderated questions from me, and then we'll try to save plenty of time for questions from the audience because we all think that's the most important part of all this. So why don't we start with introductions? We'll start here with Dan.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Maury. Thank you, Abby and Western Governors Association for including us on this panel. My name is Dan West. I'm with Clean Air Task Force. We are an environmental nonprofit that seeks pragmatic solutions to achieving a zero emissions, high energy planet at an affordable cost. We have a range of technical programs across different technology and sector specific areas. We focus on the generation side, we focus mostly on next generation clean firm technologies. So we have a pretty robust nuclear program, a geothermal program. Those are, big in the West. We even have a fusion program, which, sounds sci-fi, but actually there's a lot of exciting announcements happening across the West as well, including here in Colorado. We also have an advocacy side of our organization doing state, federal, international advocacy. I'm on our state policy advocacy team, and I oversee our Western states portfolio. We're active in several states that overlap with WGA. And we're also a coalition member of Next Gen Highways. So excited to be here, and yeah, thank you.
Let's just keep going down the line. Daly?
Hi, everybody. Daly Edmunds, Director of Policy for Audubon Rockies. And Audubon Rockies is a regional office of National Audubon Society. As the Director of Policy and Outreach, I've been doing a lot of work for over a decade now, looking at generation and transmission projects on the landscape. And while our office covers Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah, we also have a national team, and we also have staff in DC. So hopefully we'll be able to make more connections here today and really appreciate the opportunity. And when I was looking at the panels and who all is speaking and who's in attendance here, realized that I'm in a really unique position in being able to represent conservation organizations. And so I wanted to share maybe why is Audubon on this panel? Why do we care about this issue? And it comes down to habitat. And there was a Conservation in the West poll, comes out every year. And the one that came out this year found that when they looked at voters across 8 states, that 4 and 5 have identified loss of habitat as a serious issue. So that's what I'm here to talk about, and the perspective that I bring is the habitat side. Habitat loss is a huge issue. There was a study put out about a decade ago by Conservation Science Partners, and between 2001 and 2011, they found that there's a football field's worth of natural areas in the West that are lost every 2.5 minutes. That is massive. When you think about just one day, that's about 600 football fields. So we're losing habitat across the West. Now, what are the reasons for that? Urban sprawl. I drove here from Fort Collins. The urban sprawl across I-25 is insane. And it's also energy development. These are the 2 largest drivers of natural area loss. We're seeing our population growing. We're seeing that in a lot of the Western states. So we're all struggling with how do we meet the demands, the growing populations, while keeping our areas, our open areas functioning, providing wildlife habitat, which also supports a lot of our economies. When we talk about loss of habitat, we also talk about how that affects species. The EPA put out a report just recently that more than 50 species have gone extinct in the last century because specifically of habitat loss. Audubon, We are a national organization. We protect birds and habitat. And so I look at it from the birds lens. I work with colleagues across the country, also across 12 different countries, Western Hemispheric. And we have found elevating concerns. We're very science-based. And there was a paper that came out, maybe you all have heard of it, that compared to the number of birds we had in 1970, we have 3 billion fewer birds. That's 1 in 4 birds gone since 1970. And that is remarkable because we're not talking just about species that are really that are already threatened or imperiled, but we're also talking, it's across all birds in US and Canada. And we're talking about those that are common. So we're thinking there's fewer robins, there are fewer western meadowlarks, there are fewer barn swallows, mallards, etc. And so when we think about that, we're also seeing that as these species are declining, those gaps are not being filled by another species that's maybe more tolerant of human activity, but they're actually just going away. So when you go outside today, it's actually quieter. There's fewer birds singing than about 50 years ago. So while habitat loss is a big driver for loss of populations across the world, including here in the US, climate change is another big issue. And so Audubon is working on climate change as well. How can we address that? How can we get more renewables on the ground? But how can we do it responsibly so that there are well-sited transmission lines, energy generation projects? So really appreciate being here today.
Thank you. Randy.
Awesome. Thanks, Maury, and thanks to the Western Governors Association for inviting us to this panel. I hear what Daly's saying. I had the opportunity last night to be with 50 or 60 Audubon advocates in Indianapolis and heard directly from them about their concerns about habitat, and we got to explain a little bit about what Next Gen Highways is about and how that might be able to help with birding populations. So super appreciate that. Anyway, I'm Randy Satterfield, Executive Director of Next Gen Highways, and glad to be with you all.
So Randy, I think next up was for you to give a high-level overview of what Next Gen Highways is and some of the work that you've done here in Colorado, and then we'll get into some questions about all that work.
You bet. So Next Gen Highways is a policy and advocacy initiative promoting the co-location of transmission lines on existing linear infrastructure corridors where possible and where it makes sense. So linear infrastructure corridors, that includes highways. That also can include existing transmission line corridors. Utilities do quite a bit of that work already. You might ask why? What's the point? And here are a couple of benefits, and we've experienced some of these. I'm based in Wisconsin, spent nearly 20 years at the transmission-only utility in Wisconsin, and we've been siting and permitting transmission in highways for nearly 20 years. And other linear corridors as well. And some of the benefits that we've been able to experience is you can speed the permitting process. And kind of one, for example, there is if you think about working with one landowner in a Department of Transportation as opposed to potentially tens or even hundreds of private landowners. You can also lessen environmental impacts. A highway corridor is already a disturbed corridor. So if you got to build a transmission line from substation A to substation B and you can put it on a highway or greenfield development, well, you can understand how the environmental impacts will be lessened by utilizing the highway corridor. And then 3, what's becoming increasingly more and more important, I think, and we heard some of this with the banana references and NIMBY references earlier, is lessen impacts to private landowners. Does anybody know anybody who's ever volunteered to host a power line on their property? I'm seeing no hands. I haven't either, and I've sited and permitted probably north of 1,000 miles of transmission lines. So where we can, avoid impacting private landowners, right? We should take advantage of that, and utilizing transmission line corridors, highway corridors, maybe rail corridors are ways to do that. Here's the problem. In, I think it's 43 states across the country, state departments of transportation have prohibitions policy prohibitions to co-locating transmission lines on interstate highway corridors. Many of them allow transmission lines on their state highways. So it's not that they wholly object to the idea of co-location. However, they have these antiquated, outdated policies that stem from the advent of the interstate highway system in the 50s that they just haven't gotten around to modernizing and updating. So 43 state DOTs across the country with policies prohibiting the co-location of a power line on an interstate highway. Interstate highways typically are the most valuable asset, right? They typically have more physical right-of-way availability on them. When the Eisenhower administration built out the interstate highway system, they acquired a fair chunk of land, and state DOTs have added to that. That prohibitive policy stemmed in part from the Department of Defense's desire to be able to land aircraft on the interstate highway system. This is from the 50s, mind you, a very different time. The world was a very different place. Well, those prohibitive policies held at US DOT through the mid-'80s or so, when telecom companies started petitioning for the opportunity to bury telecom infrastructure in the interstate highway system. And over the next couple of decades, US DOT got rid of all of its prohibitions. So today there is no federal prohibition to co-locating transmission on interstate highways. And it's evident in the fact that my former company, we put 100 miles of 345 kV transmission on the Interstate 90-94 corridor in Wisconsin. So we've got 43 state DOTs with prohibitive policies. And then what's that mean from a utility or developer standpoint? Well, they're not making a phone call to the DOT to ask about co-locating transmission on a highway corridor. So we are working in states across the country to work with organizations in those states, and we'll talk a little bit about that process here in Colorado. Organizations that are interested in this idea of common sense transmission line siting to figure out what policies need to be changed to deal with those DOT prohibitions. Maybe just one other quick point on, and then we can dive in maybe to the Colorado process a little bit. We came into Colorado, I think it was probably spring of last year. We had heard from some stakeholders here who saw some of the work we were doing in Minnesota. We changed policy in Minnesota in 2024 and began having conversations with our friends at Audubon and Clean Air Task Force, who I have to thank, right, as both state coalition members, but also members of our national coalition. So we began having conversations with stakeholders in the spring of 2024 and built out a pretty good coalition of organizations and engaged with Maury and CETA as a co-convener of our work here. And then we're successful in being able to move a legislative package through that now makes all Colorado highways available for transmission line co-location. I'll pause there, Maury.
Okay, so nice job. Thank you, Randy. So I have a series of questions here. I'm gonna organize them as follows. I'm gonna ask the panelists to talk about the benefits of co-location as they see it. Then I think we're gonna maybe talk about some of the barriers. I think Randy hit on some of the benefits. He also talked about some of the barriers, but there might be other barriers. Talk about the barriers, and then we'll get into a discussion of some of the solutions. And sort of next-gen highways is certainly one state solution. There might be other solutions. There might be some lessons learned from Colorado and lessons learned from other states. And then last but not least, we'll ask if there's any federal solutions or any work that needs to be done at the federal level. So let's jump in. What are the benefits of co-locating transmission with other linear infrastructure in existing right-of-ways? Anyone want to go?
I can take that. As I mentioned earlier, I've been working on transmission and generation projects along with a lot of my Audubon colleagues, as well as those across the sportsman and conservation community for years. And we have jointly gone in and try to find solutions for transmission development, especially those that go across multiple states, and trying to find solutions that get from point A to point B and to find the route that has the least amount of wildlife impact. And a lot of those times, that's where you're talking about co-locating, because you're reducing having to break new ground. That area also allows for being able to have easier maintenance. So there's a lot of benefits to going ahead and co-locating as much as possible to reduce habitat disturbances.
And yeah, we'll second that. CATF, I mentioned we advocate a lot on clean, firm generation, but we also have a great infrastructure team that seeks to overcome barriers and streamline development of transmission. So, avoiding a multitude of landowners, avoiding potential harms to wildlife habitat. Those are great benefits of this policy. I would also say, in addition to just overcoming barriers, I think this policy helps put developers in a more kind of proactive posture in seeking financing, encouraging, entities like the transmission authorities or individual developers to come out with a plan, to prioritize existing utility rights of way, but also highways. That gives certainty to investors, which would then make it more likely for them to put up that money. I often think of this philosophical principle, Occam's razor, that's often applied in science, but generally it's like the simplest solution, or the simplest explanation is oftentimes the best solution. That's not always the case, but I like to apply that to this concept in a policy sense. There's so many proposals out there to try to solve the transmission problem, but this one is one of the simplest, and I think it's one of the easiest for the public and even policymakers and legislators who legislate as kind of their side job, want to do something, don't have much time to understand it. This one's really easy to pick up.
Yeah, maybe just a couple of other anecdotal things, Maurice. I've had conversations with multiple farm bureaus in Western states. And what I've heard from many of those folks is, lessening the impacts on ag land, and on farmers, especially some of those who are already, participating in some renewable energy projects. And then just to further that point, we've been active in the state of Iowa. We had a bill introduced last session and just ran out of time, but we'll get it done this time. But our sponsors in Iowa are keenly focused on, as they say, protecting their agricultural landowners' farming interest. And then kind of conversely, but related, we're doing some work out east and trying to move policy in Massachusetts to get a kind of a foothold in the eastern seaboard. And one of the things we're hearing from stakeholders out there is there's just not a lot of land to put new transmission lines. And so highway corridors in some cases may be some of the better options. And then some of our other stakeholders are, while there's a pause maybe in some offshore wind development, are still thinking down the road when some of that may come back, and the value in being able to use highway corridors to move electrons from shoreline substations to inland substations.
So it sounds like we've got a real simple, real common sense solution here. What are the barriers to getting this done? What are the challenges of convincing state transportation departments to change how they do business, or working with railroads, or working with interstate pipelines? What are some of the barriers to getting this done?
I think there's a lot of barriers to the idea of the NIMBY. And there may be a common perception that conservation organizations are going to be opposed to everything. I'll set the record straight. It's not the case. When Audubon is talking to our members and partners, et cetera, we can come to a common understanding that energy generation and demand is only growing So let's think about how we're going to have that generation happen, where we're going to have it happen. How are we going to get that generation to our cities, our load centers? So we need to think really thoughtfully and carefully. So when you think about barriers, sometimes it's having those conversations and having those one-on-one conversations, working with the public, making sure you have the right stakeholders there, thinking about, as Randy mentioned, private landowners. That is a huge issue. Sometimes people can feel like they are not aware of a project happening until it's almost done, and people are feeling like it is out of their control. And nobody enjoys feeling that. So I think making sure we have strong public and stakeholder engagement is critical. That will help with quite a few barriers.
And maybe picking up on that theme a little bit, right? In my opening comments, I referenced the policy barriers. So that's easy to understand. But the other barrier that we see both within state agencies, but also frankly in my former brethren within the transmission utility and development space is kind of cultural barriers or institutional inertia, right? So the idea of putting a power line on an interstate highway system in the vast majority of states in the union has not been allowed ever. So what's that mean? That means nobody's ever considered it or collaborated on it or had discussions about it. And so that results in some cultural, right, and institutional inertia around that idea. That coupled, right, kind of with siloing in the way that we think about infrastructure planning and deployment. And so maybe I'm venturing more into solutions, but part of what we're trying to advocate for when we go into states is as Daly was mentioning, let's have a more open and engaged collaborative process with state agencies, the builders of transmission, and other stakeholders to figure out where are the best locations to put this infrastructure that's going to help, society live and advance. And, kind of the old way of the utilities kind of going in the back room and figuring out the route and then presenting it to the public, I'm not sure that flies anymore. So I think more collaborative approach, looking at all options, might be a good way to go.
So who are the critical stakeholders to get into that meeting, bring to the table, right? I mean, in the energy space, we typically work with the incumbent utilities and maybe the ratepayer advocate and some electric utility renewable energy concerns, but the number of stakeholders that are needed to achieve this is much broader. What are the key constituencies that we need to bring to the table?
More of me. I think taking a recognition that that these developments impact large swaths of our communities and what are the interests of those communities. Having organizations that are there to represent sportsmen, outdoor recreation, the different land uses, when there are different councils representing the communities, that's really important as well. That is really helpful in breaking down barriers. And I will say when as a conservation organization, when we get fielded by calls all the time of, can you help us stop this project, by random members of the public? And we'll say, well, actually, the department, the Game and Fish Department, the State Game and Fish Department, Colorado Parks and Wildlife here, for example, they're part of this. They're part of the process. There is that level of comfort of, oh, okay, we have the state is involved. One of the values that we care about is being considered. So I think also making sure you have the role and the engagement of the right state agencies helping to influence the outcome.
Yeah, right. So here in Colorado, we were able to put together a pretty broad and diverse coalition, but we also had, as I mentioned before, we had Maury and CETA as a co-convener. I don't know if James is still in the room. Yeah, there's James. So the Energy Office was an incredibly valuable partner in our effort, as was the Governor's Office and the DOT. And the Colorado DOT was maybe a little bit unique from other DOTs that we've interacted with. They asked for a seat at the table, had a seat at the table, and were actively engaged. And I recall even a conversation we had one day where we were suggesting to them that they could probably make the changes that needed to be made administratively, right, through rulemaking within the department. And they said, yeah, we probably could, but we'd like to concretize this idea in statute. And so that's what we did. But that was, right, the effort here in Colorado was kind of the perfect storm of stakeholders, I think, to help push a pretty exhaustive bill through the process pretty darn quickly. I'd also add, kind of to the list of organizations, and we might have missed on this one here, but I think even consumer advocates are also good folks to bring into this conversation, because there can be good arguments to be made that co-location can also keep costs down, keep project costs down to benefit ratepayers. And then certainly if you can deploy projects a little more quickly, that's better for ratepayers as well, because you're putting that capital to work more quickly. And if you're in an organized market, which I know we're not here, but if you're in an organized market, that asset then is also being able to operate in that organized market more quickly. I'll leave it there.
One thing the legislation here in Colorado did is it asked developers of transmission to consider a priority list of rights of way. Randy, you want to describe that and talk about the priorities and why you think that's effective?
Sure. So the language, it's fairly simple. It kind of just simply says that when a builder of transmission is considering a new project, that they consider corridors in priority order, with existing corridors being first. So transmission line corridors, highway corridors, before considering greenfield development. The language is not mandating building on any one corridor or the other, simply an incentive, I guess, to consider existing linear corridors before considering greenfield development. We think that language is important for a couple of reasons. One, to signal to the parties, both state agencies, utilities, and other stakeholders, that the examination of existing corridors is important and should be considered. But like I said, I'm pretty sure we have language in the Colorado bill that makes it clear that in no way is that consideration meant to be a mandate to build in those corridors, rather an examination of are they viable or not. And frankly, that stems from what the Wisconsin legislature, my home state, what the Wisconsin legislature did in 2003. At that point in time in the state of Wisconsin, the transmission only utility was relatively new, had just published a report showing that $1 billion of new transmission was needed to be built in the state. There was a highly controversial project in development in the state. I think the Northeast blackout occurred earlier in the year, and members of the legislature saw that report that said $1 billion of transmission was needed. And then the project that was not doing so well, and they said, well, there's probably got to be maybe a better way. So they passed, I think it was Wisconsin Act 89 in 2003, that prioritized corridors in a similar way, that then led to the State Department of Transportation revising its policies, because its policies were prohibitive to co-location at that time. And once they revised their policies, then we began, at the transmission company, began proposing co-located projects.
So we've spent a lot of time focusing on highways and interstate right-of-ways. What's next? What other linear right-of-ways should we be targeting? What are we missing?
Take us back one step, actually.
Please.
So have folks heard of the reference, the canary in the coal mine? So the canary in the coal mine, for those that don't know the origin story of it, was that canaries served as sort of an indicator species, a warning, if you will. They were more, or are more, sensitive to air quality conditions than humans. And so the miners would take a caged canary down into the mines with them. And they would use that as an early warning sign if the carbon monoxide levels got too high. The bird would start to wobble and basically tip over. That was a warning sign for the miners to grab the bird and head on out. So as we talk about wildlife being part of this conversation and habitat being a consideration of where we do all this generation and transmission and how we do it, birds are an indicator species that the quality of our habitat and our lands are not doing well. Having said that, I will say one priority part of where to locate these was right before going to green fields is to avoid wildlife migration areas and important habitat. That was really important for the wildlife community to make sure that was in there to try and keep as much of that habitat intact as possible.
Thanks, Daly. And, rail, right, is an option as well. We're not as focused on rail. There are some other folks in this space that are promoting the use of rail corridors. And I know there's an independently developed transmission project in the Midwest that proposes to utilize rail corridors for a buried HVDC line from Iowa into Chicago. So rail is certainly an option. The key difference between rail and our focus on highways is really kind of public versus private, right? If you're going rail, you're more likely going to be working with a private rail company, to where our initiative is more focused on state DOT policy. And then, there might be some option for pipeline. I'm just not sure of any conflicts potentially between a power line and a pipeline, and if those conflicts would exist if the pipeline's buried or not, but pipeline corridors could be an option for evaluation as well.
Building on the idea of railroads, they have, they're crisscrossing. They're also along many of the highways, but you do have them going to servicing a lot of the main load centers. So it is a natural next step. And as we're thinking about what are some creative solutions, which I think there's such brain power in the room and online today, it's creative solutions. If we think about the ups and downs of different energy sources, and we think of with coal, for example, with railroads, is this a possibility of getting more revenue if there can be a partnership of co-locating transmission lines along railroads? So I think, again, it's kind of thinking outside the box, and maybe going outside of our silos as well, and thinking, how can we all lean towards the recognition we're going to need more energy? How are we going to get it there with the least impactful way?
Yeah, I'll add on to that and speak to a previous question too about what other stakeholders, and I can't remember. It was such a diverse coalition already, but were there counties that did county associations or group like that support the bill? I can't remember. It's okay. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Randy, but
I know they weren't members of the coalition, but they were supportive of what we were doing.
Oh, great. Yeah. Well, to my point, I would bring in local governments as well, and other siding conversations. Oftentimes counties and local governments come head to head with developers or even the state. In this case, and I'm not speaking for counties, but if I was a county commissioner, I would probably see this proposal as an easier lift, already dealing with existing infrastructure going through my jurisdiction, as opposed to, having to face down potentially some angry constituents.
All right. Any policy recommendations at the state level or the federal level? Anything we need to be doing more of or better at the state level? Any lessons learned from what we've done here in Colorado?
Well, I'm going to start at the federal level, and then we'll see what Daly and Dan have to say. I mentioned at the top, there's not US DOT or any other federal prohibition to co-locating in interstate highway corridors. However, certainly a couple things could be helpful. It could be helpful if the Secretary of DOT, a fellow cheesehead like myself, right? Made some sort of policy announcement that interstate highway corridors are available, are open for business, if you will. I'd even go further and to say a joint statement from the Secretary of Energy and the Secretary of DOT recognizing the value of the interstate corridors towards a super abundant, did I get that right? A super abundant grid could be helpful and beneficial. And we're also involved in some of the policy discussions around permitting reform. And one of the more tangible things that we're looking at is the idea of the federal government offering some modest resources to state departments of transportation that change their utility accommodation policies to allow for transmission line co-location. And those resources would be for the state DOTs to utilize to support their permitting staff that would need to gear up a little bit for potential applications for co-location permits.
All right. Well, thank you for answering my questions. I think we have some time here, so let's turn it over to the audience for any questions that you may have. I see some hands up over here on the right.
Hi, everyone. Alice Madden, National Audubon Society. I just want to thank Randy. I mean, I wish we had a Randy to focus in on every problem we have. This guy found a problem, created an organization, has been marching across the country. So in each state, I think the process has gotten better, more inclusive. So anyway, I just wanted to say congratulations. You made it look easy, and I know it's not. So,
Alice,
Yeah.
you make me blush.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Alice. But obviously we can't do this alone. And as when we go into every state and when we came into Colorado, one of the first things we acknowledge is we're carpetbaggers, right? We're not locals. That's why we need to build these coalitions of state organizations that, support this maybe small, maybe niche, yet potentially impactful idea of maybe a better way to site and permit transmission. So thanks to our Colorado State Coalition partners.
Hey, Randy, over here. I was curious, so I looked up, I don't think you named the states that have eliminated the prohibition. And so I was looking up on the map on your website. It's an interesting, strange bedfellows. I'm curious, can you name those off and then say, like, what's the through line there? What is it? Just you guys approach them and they're like, this is kind of a dumb prohibition, let's get rid of it. And what has been any pushback, if any, in other states? Why is it still around? It seems like something that's kind of silly. Why would they not get rid of it? I mean, you talked a little bit about, but can you elaborate on what your advocacy efforts have discovered?
Yeah. So we've moved policy in 2 states, Minnesota and Colorado. We are active with bill drafts in Michigan, Indiana, Iowa, Illinois, and Massachusetts, and then operating in another, 10 or 12 states, doing the kind of the coalition building process. It's interesting. I was in a meeting with senior DOT officials in a Midwestern state a few weeks ago, and presenting, our idea. And this senior DOT official said, well, you can't build transmission in the interstates. And I said, well, you can. I've been part of teams permitting and building transmission in interstates. He said, well, no, you can't. And so we pulled out the computer and got the policy guidance from US DOT from a few years ago. So part of the challenge is folks not having a full understanding of kind of the realities on the ground. So at the DOT level, a lot of it is informing and educating, right? And then sharing experiences. And I had mentioned Wisconsin, right? Wisconsin, we had permitted a few hundred miles of transmission in highway right away and have a lot of tools of ours. When I say ours, my former company, but also from DOT, that we can share with developers, utilities, as well as DOT officials. And we actually even connected this senior level Midwestern DOT person with the permitting engineer from Wisconsin DOT, who's been through 25, 26 co-location projects. So a lot of it's just kind of lack of awareness. And then why hasn't anything happened? Nobody's asked. Nobody's come along and said, hey, maybe it's time to change this policy.
Any other questions?
I'll just ask to be super clear on this, this is a cultural issue within those state DOTs, not, maybe it's a regulatory thing, but it's definitely not a statutory issue.
No, it is a statutory issue.
Out of how many of them?
Yeah, that I don't have the answer to. The mapping that we've done to this point has been based off the utility accommodation policies. And like I said, 43, whatever the number is, utility accommodation policies have some form of prohibition. Some of those prohibitions then are also concretized in statutory code. Not in every case, but we're finding more and more in many cases they are. But I don't have that number yet.
Gotcha. And then just another one real quick is, when you talk about, and I know this isn't your area of expertise, but when you are talking with rail folks about using those rail corridors, does that include, I don't know what you call it, like retired, not active rail lines too? And yeah.
Yes, is the answer. I know that the rail folks look at both active and not active corridors, right? And even some state DOTs, I think maybe the state of Washington, but somebody can correct me. Some state DOTs even have some significant rail assets as well. So it's possible that rail could even be an option through a state Department of Transportation.
And last one, so the going back to the roads, if the prohibition is on using interstate stuff, does that have a negative influence on using other, like state highways? Or do some states, like, they'll use state and other road right of ways, but just not the interstate? Or yeah, how does that interplay affect one or the other?
Many of the states that have those prohibitions have allowances for use of the state highways. I can't speak to how many projects have utilized state highways, but many of the states with prohibitions to the interstates do allow it on state highways. Our view, we're not transmission developers. Our view would be, if the state highway right of way is available for co-location, right? That's a very valuable public asset. And if you're going to put a power line, right, and limited asset, if you're going to put a power line on an interstate highway, I would hope that it would be kind of the highest voltage capacity you could build, 345 kV and above, because you're going to have more capacity. You're going to be able to move more electrons. You wouldn't want to put a 138 kV line on an interstate highway. That'd kind of be a waste of the resource. I'd say put the 138 kV line on your, on your state highways.
Okay, last chance for questions. So I'd sort of summarize all this by saying that I think the lesson learned here is that even if you have real simple common sense solutions, sometimes they're not self-executing. Everybody just doesn't gravitate towards them. They need people to roll up their sleeves and do some work to make them happen. And so I would encourage you all to think about co-location of transmission facilities and reach out to these experts if you are working on making these sort of common sense solutions happen in your state and your location. So join me in thanking the panel for a great conversation.
All right. I will close this out quickly here so we can get to the reception. Thank you so much to all of our speakers today, as well as Governor Post and Team Colorado for hosting us. Please join us upstairs, Raynard Social, for the reception following this immediately. 6th floor where the lunch was. We'll be back here starting at 8 a.m. tomorrow. We'll have breakfast available back upstairs at Raynard Social. We'll kick things off in this room around 8:50 tomorrow morning. Thank you so much for being here. Hope to see you at the reception.